Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Dr. Rahul Gupta. Listeners, Rahul is a physician, president of GATC Health Corp, and the former director of the U.S. Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP. He was the first medical doctor to lead ONDCP, and he served as the director from November 2021 through January 2025. And as you all may know, the PCC is dedicated to protecting the integrity of sport and public health. And today we're looking forward to talking about Dr. Gupta's important work that has enhanced public health and safety and how his contributions intersect with the work being done in the anti-doping community. So, Rahul, we are so excited to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here, Marie. Thank you.
Well, we are so excited to learn more about your experiences and have you share some insights with us. So let's perhaps start at the very beginning here, Rahul. How did you first become interested in medicine and public health and public safety?
Well, potentially one of the more important questions for those who are interested in this field. I was trained initially as a pulmonologist and then did my full internal medicine as well and began to practice privately in a very small town in rural Alabama where you are everything to your patients. You're their ER doctor, you're their primary care doctor. Someone will come to you at your home at 9 p.m. and ask you if they have questions. So you're part of that community. And as I continue to practice, I realized something, which is that oftentimes our policies aren't in line with what people need on the ground, especially across rural America for marginalized people and others. So I became interested in understanding more about what is the public policy aspects of public health, medicine, public safety, what makes our policies as opposed to not, or reimbursements behind it. And then 9/11 happened, and I had so many veterans come into my office who were struggling to choose between food and their medications. And it really gave me a pause that, hey, I need to think about learning more from a public health standpoint. And I love doing individual care, which is the practice of medicine within the four walls of a clinic or a hospital. But could I be more impactful if I had more of a population health and safety approach for larger populations? And that's kind of what got me interested.
Very interesting. And let's maybe talk about your career path. I love the story of what inspired you to pursue this, but what are the steps that you took to get here to working in the area of drug control policy?
Well, certainly I'll tell you that even then in Alabama, I was seeing that was a beginning of having not only the opioid pill crisis, but also the meth crisis where people were synthesizing this meth in their homes and selling it. I had representatives from pharmaceutical companies and others come to me almost every day, if not several times a week, selling me different types of opioids.
Oh, wow.
Even for a rural physician in Alabama, I was having that many people come. So having my feet right there and being in the trenches, as I moved to focus more on the public aspect as opposed to individual aspect of care, I took those lessons with me when we joined academia and then public health in West Virginia. Part of that was the beginning of what we call the opioid crisis now, but it was also meth, it was cocaine. And it got me much more interested because now I was in a state in West Virginia, which not only had a high rate of overdose deaths, but it remained the highest by far, second to none across our country. So I thought, what a important place, a grounds for me to learn from people who are suffering the most. And that's where I began to focus along with other public health aspects, everything from clean water and air to public safety to making sure the vaccinations were being given and chronic health conditions were being addressed. But this is one that got me very interested. So when the governor of West Virginia asked me to become the health commissioner of the state, I made sure that while we're addressing issues like cancer and other aspects, we're also laser focused on improving the conditions so we can have an impact on people who are actually dying. Because one of the things is when someone dies, it does no good to have the newest treatments after they're dead because you cannot treat dead people. So that was one of my reasons for pushing this agenda with a sense of urgency. So we learned from people in a state like West Virginia and then applied those lessons nationally.
Oh, very interesting. And can you share how this opportunity at ONDCP came about?
I know that what we did in West Virginia became a model for the nation. Dozens of states followed when we conducted the social autopsy, which is we took the people who had died in a particular year, all of them from overdose, and we learned more about them. We kind of dissected their lives for the year before their death, almost like in a CSI manner. We learned to figure out where did they live, who were their relatives, what education they had, were they married, what were their jobs. So we actually did that social autopsy, and we found that a lot of the people, oftentimes it's the loneliness, it's the fear of job loss, it's the blue-collar workers, it's those who are not really highly educated, who are disproportionately impacted by this crisis. We kind of feel that in the media and the public, but we didn't know that from a factual standpoint. And when we did, so many states and local communities started to look internally for their own data like that. And it became pretty regular policy to look at and then address those things with policy pieces. So when I got the call to lead this office at the White House, reporting directly to the President of the United States, working across 19 federal agencies from Health and Human Services, that includes organizations or institutions like CDC, NIH, FDA, the SAMHSA, and others, to Department of Justice and Defense and Homeland Security and Education and Labor, and so many more. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, especially for me as the first physician coming to this office, to be able to impact a challenge that has been so recalcitrant in our society for over 70 years. And it's been difficult to address. So I came in, and obviously it was a position that has to go through the Senate confirmation after the presidential nomination. And I got to work, basically.
I think that is remarkable. And perhaps to set the stage for listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, can you maybe share some background on its purpose and its history?
It's a very interesting history, actually, which is this was created by Congress, the office in the White House, to basically look at the entire drug control budget of the United States government, because so many agencies in government, as well as in state and local governments and communities, receive taxpayer dollars. But what we needed was really a coordination of that, and to make sure that money is going to the right policies that are being directed. That's why this office was created, but it was meant to coordinate the efforts of the United States government, both within the country and across the world. So part of this is to ensure that the $45 billion budget that is across agencies is directed in the right manner by creating what we call the National Drug Control Policy. That's a policy of the President of the United States, and that's implemented through this budget angle. Part of that's making sure that money is being spent the right way. Also understand, for instance, we used to think addiction and use of drugs was a personal choice only. And we've learned in the last several years that addiction is a disease of the brain. Pathways are very similar to what people have when they're suffering from obesity or gambling or other aspects of life. And because of the scientific advances, we have to approach addiction both from the public health side of this, provide those access to treatments. But at the same time, we also learned that the supply side of this is like a business. It's no longer like you take out a head of the cartel and everything goes away. It doesn't. And we've tried and failed in this policies for the last 70 years. So we have to treat it more like commerce, understand the supply chain networks, understand where can we be most impactful. And that's kind of the work that was so intriguing to do, which is work both on the supply side, but also on the public health side, with the singular purpose of saving American lives.
Definitely. Well, Rahul, that sounds like a lot of responsibility resting on your shoulders in this position. Can you describe, I guess, just what were some of your day-to-day roles and responsibilities leading this office?
Well, if your listeners sort of watched The West Wing or House of Cards or others, I will tell you no 2 days are similar. It can be a day when you're getting a call from the President of the United States asking you on a particular topic, having very clear expectations what needs to happen, to one where you're meeting the head of state of another country, traveling, or presidents and prime ministers. to, more importantly, even looking at the mother of a lost teenager in Washington State, for example, and being able to see her eye to eye. And when she asks you the question, what could I have done differently? Having the courage to look at her in the eye and say, here's what we're doing and here's where you can help and be part of the solution now while we share your grief. It's those types of very different roles each time, and never forget the fact that you're ultimately a director, but it's also as a dad, as a husband, as someone in the community, because people you meet along the way are those who have either suffered or are suffering from the consequences. I mean, we have terrible amount, about 48, 49 million Americans suffer from addiction, one kind or another each year. So this is a deep problem in our society, and it's one that so many families and individuals suffer from. So the human aspect is very important, no matter what the day looks like in the White House on any given day.
Definitely. I think those personal connections can be so powerful and motivating in your role. And can you maybe also describe some of the roles and responsibilities related to anti-doping?
Let me just say that along with the day-to-day work, there's some really interesting portfolios that is part of the office. One of those is the anti-doping portfolio. And I'll provide some context here. Most of the countries across the globe have what we call sports ministry. And we don't. For us, sporting is a very capitalistic good. It's mostly private sector driven, and we do a really good job with having professional and amateur leagues of each sport in the private sector. So this is the reason that when it comes to the anti-doping, especially in sports and clean competition, Congress sought to put this portfolio within ONDCP for a few reasons. One, it gives the highlight that this is in direct involvement of the President of the United States and the White House, and we value American athletes at that level. So it's really important because American athletes not only are second to none, but for the longest time, they sacrifice everything to have those achievements, to be the best in the world. And part of that's to stay clean right from the beginning. And then when I speak to American athletes, I see the commitment that goes into not just for them, but for their families, for their community, and the amount of enjoyment we all feel and pride we feel when they win the gold medals and silver medals and bronze medals. So it became very important for that office to be in the White House. And that's the role that ONDCP plays, is to house the anti-doping portfolio, but also manage it and work very closely with other allied organizations, as well as represent the United States government on various outside international organizations like the World Anti-Doping Agency, the International Olympics Committee, as well as others.
Definitely. And we'll get into some more of the details about these interactions that you've had with these different international bodies and just your work on the anti-doping front. But let's talk a little bit more about your journey and your experiences there at the ONDCP. So Rahul, can you take us back and maybe paint a picture of what the drug control landscape looked like when you began working there at ONDCP?
So when I walked into the office, literally in late October, November of 2021, what we were dealing with was about a 31% increases in overdose deaths year after year.
Oh, wow.
And we were poised to cross not only the 100,000 people mark of overdose deaths a year, but also probably get to about 112,000 or so per year. And it wasn't stopping. And there was a lot of reasons for it. But it was important as the first physician to lead this office, as well as someone who really has worked on the ground with these issues pretty much every single day, to create policies that would be long lasting. And part of that was to start to predict what will happen if we stay the course and what will happen if we were to implement policies. And I'll describe those in a little bit because that's also important. And what we found was that if we stayed the course, we will probably see about 160,000 plus deaths by the end of 2025, which is end of this year. But if we could be courageous enough to implement the right policies and resource them, then we can have half of that. We will have half of that. And that's the predictive analytics we conducted at the time. So it became very important that we would be saving 30, 40,000 lives a year moving forward if we did our jobs right. So for us, that meant initially, think about when you're bleeding out on a battlefield. The first thing you have to do is stop the bleeding. And then you put the fluid and transfer the soldier back to where they could survive. And we knew, how do you stop the bleeding at a time when an American is dying every 5 minutes around the clock? Well, that's to significantly increase access and affordability to life-saving medications like naloxone or Narcan, which is an antidote when you're dying from overdose. So we put the entire force of our efforts onto doing that. We made this medications available over the counter. We reduced prices from $120 to 2 doses to $24. We made it accessible at no cost to most people, while saving lives first and then expanding treatment for people, getting them into recovery and other aspects. And yet so, just last year, if you look at the data, we saw that at the end of 2024, there is a 30+% drop in overdose deaths, which means about 27,000 lives that are still there today. And we're proud of those.
That's remarkable.
So we met our target a year ahead of our goal. You got to put your mind to it. You got to make sure that right policies are in place, which ultimately balances the public health and public safety sides to look at as two sides of the same coin. And that's been an important achievement, because never in the history of the United States we've been able to have these types of life-saving efforts in this area.
Definitely. It sounds like things were difficult when you were walking into the office. You had a lot of challenges to address. And I know, just thinking about overall U.S. policy, there are so many different competing priorities. Can you share why it's so critical for a country like the U.S. to manage issues with drug overdose and other drug control concerns and really prioritize this problem?
Yeah, absolutely, Marie. I think one of the first things we have to do, I think nowhere is it true that even today, as you look at the landscape of what's happening across the world, which is we have to walk the talk. Internationally, one of the things I heard consistently is that, look, United States, you have a demand problem. And you have always talked about a supply problem, but you actually have a problem where you're not treating adequately people who are suffering from addiction. And these are the same people that you need for workforce. For example, our number one killer for people 25 to 44 years, people working age, is the opioid crisis. It's fentanyl, it's drugs. So first is the recognition of the fact that, yes, we have a problem within our nation, within the boundaries, while we work on the supply side. So recognition of those becomes very important for any aspect of it. The second is to let's get to work on how do we address that? How do we get resources, support to communities and people across they feel like everybody's working in partnership for the same goals. That's why, progress is always, I think, based on how effectively one is able to communicate very clear goals to the public and work in tandem. We work with Ad Council to put information out there talking about the dangers of fentanyl and the need for carrying naloxone. We had over 2 billion impressions of that work to make sure that awareness and knowledge is getting out there so that more and more parents are talking to their children about the importance of understanding and carrying naloxone, but also making sure that you're looking after each other when you're in school, and make sure that if someone else is ordering medication or not feeling well, to seek help first, as opposed to try to go on social media and get that help.
I think that's critical. And it sounds like the opioid and overdose problems have been front and center during your work there at the ONDCP. Can you share what were some of your key goals during your tenure there?
Our primary goal was to save lives. I felt like we were in the middle of a crisis, and every day that passes is a day we're losing people. So it's important to enact strategies and get programs out there that are working to save lives first. And beyond that is obviously making sure that we have the necessary partnership with Congress, with communities across the country, with stakeholders to be able to further these goals of saving lives. So it was important. And then we obviously had metrics that we followed, and we make sure that our work is along those lines that we had predicted, that if we were successful, we will be able to get to a number and then continue to work. Because even if I say we can reduce from 165,000 deaths a year to 80,000, that's too many. Where we want to get to as a nation is where anyone and everyone is able to get the help when and where they need it. We're able to get people back to work, back to not being lonely again and finding meaningful purpose in life. So those were some of those areas we excelled at getting more people and businesses to work on recovery-friendly workplaces so that people did feel welcomed and they felt sort of meaningful work as well. So all of these became important. Part of that was, of course, our work within the anti-doping space to ensure, because look, I see oftentimes the young athletes as examples that the next generation of Americans look at. So it was also important, both from an exemplary standpoint, but also substantive, uphold the aspects of clean sport as part of that work at ONDCP.
Definitely. And perhaps we can dig a little bit more into the metrics and data that you alluded to. What were some of the outcomes and milestones that you were looking at from your work there at ONDCP?
When we look at epidemiologically, any large crisis that happens, whether it's obesity, drugs, and others, these curves, they don't reverse overnight. So one of the things that happens is you work with your data to make sure that the level of rise slows down. That's the first thing that you would see epidemiologically. Next thing you see is flattening of the curve. And perhaps the last thing you see is decline in the curve. So we knew that we had to begin to achieve some of these goals initially of just flattening of the curve of overdose deaths. And overdose deaths are like the tip of the pyramid. Beneath these are people who are suffering from addiction. And we have to address that too, obviously with prevention and other aspects. So we began to see very early data that showed us we're pretty much in 2022 and 23 that now we're starting to see a flattening of the increase. I know it's very geeky to think about that, but the first thing when you're spiking in any data format, the first thing you see is the slow rate of the spike, after which follows the flattening and then decline. So we follow that very closely. I mean, behind every effort, behind every policy change, where we have all of these data people that were working very closely to monitor the changes in data so we can make sure that we're staying on our goals and we adjust accordingly. This is very important because whenever we work on a massive basis, a national basis, it's critical to adhere to the science as well as the data behind it to inform your work as well as your output and outcomes.
Definitely. And you really highlighted the overdose deaths. And I think this is a huge problem, but the problem is bigger than just the deaths, as you mentioned there. So there are people who are struggling and suffering and are still alive. Is there any way to get insight into the scope of that part of the problem?
Yeah, I think that's a very important issue within the United States. And it's pretty exclusive to the US, if you think about it, because it's not that other countries don't have this problem, but our problem is significant. As I mentioned, there's about 48 to 49 million Americans today who suffer from addiction of one kind or another, according to the most recent data. What that means is, if you just do the math, it's like 1 out of 7 Americans that are suffering from some type of addiction, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, whether it's other substances. And when I travel across the world, not many countries match us on those numbers. So I began to think, why is that? And oftentimes those countries we consider, let's say, less sophisticated or less developed. One of the things I've noticed is they have more community connections. They have more ability to have those networks, especially in rural areas where community care for each other. People feel valued. Maybe so much technology has not penetrated enough there. So the rates are much lower. And that's an important lesson for us too, because one of the things that we have to always think about is, okay, are we giving enough to our young people and others the opportunity beyond the screen time, beyond the aspect that lead to loneliness and other mental health issues? Because mental health and addiction are like a two-way street. One can happen with the other and vice versa. And we have to really consider both as dual aspects of a challenge, not isolated aspects. So I think it becomes very important within the American context for us to understand that as we move forward, this is an issue that we grapple with as a very complex, but at the same time, an issue that's so intrinsic to our population, our people. And we have to look at things. For example, our Surgeon General issued the first report that linked with plenty of data of any use of alcohol to cancer. Those are an important aspect that we have to think about as well. Are there pieces of this from an addiction standpoint that lead to other diseases as well? But then are we enabled enough to create the support networks across our country when people need help. That was one of the reasons that we created the 988 call line across the country. So if someone is suffering from a mental health crisis or addiction crisis, that 24/7 they can call 988 to get the help.
Absolutely. And I think, Rahul, you made tremendous progress during just 4 years there at the office of ONDCP. Can you maybe summarize, what do you see as some of your key achievements, or what are the things that you're most proud of?
I think the biggest achievement that I feel proud of for the nation is the fact that we were able to, for the first time in United States history, lower significantly and consistently the overdose death rates by about 30% plus. And when you look at fentanyl, it's even deeper than that, which results in savings of tens of thousands of lives. This is hard data. This is real people, and this is real progress. It's important to note that this is not only hard-fought progress from communities to stakeholders to those who have lost a loved one, that have all been part of this progress, but it's also one that is often tenuous and difficult and can easily unravel if we take our eyes off the ball. So it's important that while this progress has been very clearly documented over the last year or two, that we continue to do everything possible, especially with current administration, to ensure that we maintain this progress. Because at the end of the day, not supporting or maintaining is not an option, because on the other side of this is American lives that we must protect and save.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point. What do you see as some of these key things that we need to do to keep this momentum and prevent things from sliding backwards?
First of all, as I mentioned, when someone is overdosing, and oftentimes like 3 out of 4 times, it's because of an opioid, a drug often called fentanyl. It's important to have the antidote for that medication widely available, just like we see defibrillators on the wall or fire alarms. I think we have to make this product available widely. The prices have come down significantly. The states and communities have an opportunity to have it available in malls and restaurants and schools, transit systems, and other places, so that we don't allow anyone to die. That's the first part, as well as in our personal medicine cabinets at home. Secondly, people are overdosing oftentimes, not always, but often because they are suffering from addiction. So we have to get people help. We've expanded telehealth. Now people can get that help anytime they want to, 24/7. And we've got to get them medications and other aspects of this, which is an issue, which is something that we've not had any significant progress in terms of new medications over the last several years. And thirdly, I think when people are doing well and they're in recovery, respect that lifelong recovery process, making sure that we are supporting people in recovery, whether it's in housing or employment or education, transportation, and other aspects. Because when we can provide people a supportive environment in recovery, then they will continue to thrive, not just survive lifelong, and ultimately contribute to the society and contribute to the economy of our country.
Definitely. Well, Rahul, thank you so much for sharing some of the details about your work there at ONDCP. And I know your work has had amazing impacts in the public health domain. And we also alluded to earlier in our conversation the relevance of your work for anti-doping. So I'd love to dig into some of those details as well. I know you served as the U.S. representative on WADA's executive committee. Can you share how this opportunity came about?
The United States actually helped establish WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, back in the 2000s. We did that because along with the international community, we felt it was really important to have a global regulator that would make sure that when competitions are happening, there is a level playing field for national competitions. It was important because, as we have seen since, it is possible for individual athletes as well as their sponsoring states to cheat when it comes to competitions, unless there's a strong and robust system in place that can pick up these cheaters and, more importantly, work to regulate this type of cheating so that we have more and more athletes that feel that it's more important to play a fair level game, as well as nations. We have, in one way or another, as United States, been represented on the WADA's governing boards. There's 2, executive committee, and there's a foundation board as well. However, when I began my sort of term in the White House, I recognized that over the last few years, the system had worked itself where we were no longer going to be in a position to advocate strongly for American athletes, meaning that being on one of these committees. It was not acceptable to us because we had just seen Sochi Olympics. We had seen what Russia had done as part of attempting to cheat and succeeding in some situations in that aspect. And we wanted to make sure that the United States stands at the vanguard for American athletes and all athletes across the world. They expect a level playing field. So we worked to get back on the executive committee. And one of the ways to do it was to represent the Americas. There is something called CADE, that's the Sports Council of the Americas. It's a 41-member nation group representing North America, Central and South America. So for the first time in WADA's history, we ran for an election in April of 2023 and unanimously won that election democratically. So we became the America's representative on the executive committee of WADA. It was important for the United States to be there, but now we were not only representing the United States, we were representing the entire Americas region and advocating for the athletes who also wanted to make sure that we have a level playing field.
Absolutely. And maybe can you go into some of the details of the priorities that you and others discussed on this committee and what your experience was like just engaging with these key anti-doping stakeholders and leaders from around the world?
Yeah, Marie, I think as an international body, it was important for the United States as well as the representation of the Americas to ensure that there was fair governance of the committee as well as its member states. But we're looking at this as an important part of this because one thing we wanted was to have independent athletes represented on these committees. We wanted to make sure that the voices of the athletes are not being undermined because of any reason. Another part of this was to make sure that there's an independent and valid process of ethics, so there's no conflicts of those who are on the committee. We also wanted to make sure that both the president and the vice president for WADA are independent of the influence of either the countries or the games industry. This is important because your listeners might be wondering why. Well, sports is a multi-billion-dollar business at the end of the day. So there's a lot of stakes. And in any area where there's a lot of stakes, there's always those who would attempt to tilt the ground into their favor. But at the end of the day, when I speak to an American athlete, and I've spoken to so many, the reason that they train so much, sometimes from their very young childhood, and really sacrifice everything, every holiday, every wedding to go to, every other aspects, just to make sure they're training. They're often spending hours and hours and hours in their sport training just so they can have that little slight edge and win through fair means. It is just not fair for maybe some other athletes to figure out how to shortcut that route and cheat. It becomes really important. So our entirety of our work on the executive committee was to ensure that we are working with like-minded partners on the committee to hold, first of all, WADA accountable for its actions, ensure that various bodies within departments of WADA are executing in a way that they should be as an international body. And then finally, making sure that athletes, no matter where they are, competition, no matter which they are finding it a fair and level playing field to be able to compete in.
Absolutely. And can you share perhaps some of the outcomes of your endeavors in the anti-doping sphere? I know the elephant in the room is that there is some tension right now surrounding WADA, surrounding just how this all works.
Yeah, so we got to work very early after we joined, and we were working towards making sure that there are proper systems in place, proper rules in place. There are regular meetings. But part of that was the old principle of make sure there's no surprises. And we would regularly meet. We would regularly work together and collaboratively with both leadership at WADA, but also our colleagues on the executive committee with very clear expectations. And part of it's that the United States pays significant dues as part of being on the committee, which is significantly higher than the next member on the committee. And we do that because we like to not only pull our weight in terms of paying our dues, but to demonstrate to the world as leaders that we will stand for the right aspects of this. We want a fair sport. We believe in clean sport. But it was until the Times article that was published, which really surprised all of us, frankly, because what had happened was we had the very clear expectation that while we sit in the very significant governing board of WADA, that if there were any controversies or other aspects that would happen, we would be informed about those. Those will come in front of the board, so to speak. We would be told about this so that there is no confusion about it. And we could provide that, you could say, guidance to the leadership of WADA in those terms of what the expectations are of the governing board. But none of that happened. So we were all surprised to see the report that was published in April of 2024. And it was really a revelation that emerged that showed an investigation revealing that 23 Chinese swimmers had tested positive for a banned substance called trimethazidine, or TMC, before the 2021 Tokyo Olympics. And despite those positive tests, WADA had accepted their explanation of the contamination without conducting an independent investigation, which allowed ultimately the athletes to compete in Tokyo Olympics, and several of them had won medals. So when that happened, we clearly wanted to ask questions. We wanted to see what's going on. Why weren't the leadership that's the governing board of whatever notified about this? Why the investigation hadn't happened, and all of that. So that incident clearly had far-reaching consequences because, first of all, the American athletes who had trained tirelessly for the opportunity to compete on the world stage now found themselves questioning the very integrity of the competition. And swimmer Alison Schmidt at the time, who's a 4-time Olympic gold medalist, she said something like, a lot of us are going to be haunted by this podium finish that may have been impacted by doping. So it became a rallying cry for so many American athletes, including Michael Phelps and so many others. What's going on? Why are we not having a level playing field, at least the optics of that?
Definitely. Well, I appreciate you sharing your inside perspective there. And I know work is still being done. Conversations are still ongoing on how we can optimize global efforts to ensure clean sport. So I think this is a key challenge. And one of the other challenges that the clean sport movement faces is just how to handle new life-saving drugs that are being discovered and developed that could be misused by athletes who are hoping to gain that unfair edge in sport. So Rahul, could you share your thoughts on how we can potentially strike a balance between continuing to have these new drugs, these new substances come out that have clear potential clinical impacts, but also make them available to patients while ensuring that they don't end up in the wrong hands of athletes who are trying to cheat?
Well, on one hand, we have to support the development and discovery of new medications because they're life-saving, especially for rare diseases or ultra-rare diseases. On the other hand, as you suggested, that they could all obviously be used for asymmetric purposes or asymmetric advantages. So first thing we have to do is the organization we have in front of us, which is WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. We have to continue to reaffirm our commitment as United States to fairness, to integrity, and to the protection of clean athletes worldwide, regardless of nationality. It's important that the United States remains a leading proponent of clean sport and continues to be on those governing boards and other aspects to be able to hold our regulators accountable, to make sure that, look, there are some really good, smart, intelligent investigators within WADA. I've met them. They're very serious people, and they are those that do this job in and out every day, 7 days a week. We have those individuals. They have to be allowed to do their job to ensure that they're staying up to date with what's available for athletes to misuse, and that we have the appropriate countermeasures in terms of investigations, the science and technology being able to develop things like contamination, right? It used to be rare that an athlete would use contamination in food as a defense, but we have to make sure that we understand how the body physiology behaves in contamination versus consumption of banned substances. And that science is out there that needs to be resourced and supported so that we can make sure that the athletes understand that they're not going to be able to get away with it by the excuse of contamination. It's like the equivalent of like dog ate my homework. kind of thing.
Right.
But we've got to get to the science to match it so that we can detect these and not provide any excuse to those athletes who don't want to play by the rules.
Absolutely. I think ensuring that the research keeps pace with new therapeutics that are coming out is critically important, and finding these countermeasures, as you alluded to ensure that we're able to detect them and we can have that deterrence effect to prevent athletes from taking these substances. Those are all key steps on the path there. And I know that you've got a variety of different things going on now since you've left your position at the Office of National Drug Control Policy. So, Rahul, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now and if there's a project that you're particularly excited about?
It's really exciting because when I left the White House in January of this year, obviously I had to weigh my options and think about where do I want to have the most impact? And I'm someone that's always looking at where is the opportunity to be able to see the future and have a larger impact on that. And part of me has always been, like many people, intrigued by the role of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning systems and networks and others. And I saw where this type of work not only is becoming more integral to our daily lives, but I've across my career have dealt with this issue of drug discovery, drug approval, and others, which takes a long time. So as I was evaluating, I came across this opportunity at a company called GATC Health. Just for context, GATC are the 4 proteins, 4 codons of our DNA. That's what the name's about, and health. What these folks are doing is, first, they're actually using in silico or a computer-based platform called Multiomics Advanced Technology, or MAT, to discover drugs and almost conduct clinical trials within the computerized system platforms. As I said to myself, it's a work of fiction coming to life.
That's so cool.
Yeah. When I saw this, I was intrigued. I was amazed, and I wanted to be a part of it. So now what happens, just for your listeners, a typical molecule, when it's discovered, would take about 10 to 20 years to ever enter the market. That's how long the research takes. And it's also like $1 billion to $2 billion.
Oh, wow.
And on top of that, 90% of these molecules never make it through clinical trials and get approval. And the reason for that is because our drug discovery and approval process is so old and archaic. We're using, for example, animal testing still. And we know that animal testing for drugs is really not a well-suited example to use for humans. But that's all we had, and that's what we continue to do. Now we have technology. GATC's platform, for example, mimics human physiology. Like literally you can create a digital twin of a human and conduct those experiments in silico or computer-based platform and get a result faster, cheaper, and more effective than through animals. And at the same time, we estimate about 50 million animals a year because of the drug discovery process. So it excited me a lot. And then the other piece that is really interesting is we're able to have a validated model that can predict from a molecule whether it will ultimately survive the process or not, as opposed to literally gambling with the molecule and seeing that 90% fail ultimately. We have a validated platform that has 91% specificity for passing. So we flip the script around, all because of technology, machine learning, and deep learning networks. And all of that's so exciting to me because that's the kind of work that is going to define the future of drug discovery, drug use, in making it more affordable, accessible. And it's one of those things that every president in the last few decades has talked about, the extraordinarily expensive, the high cost of medical care, but specifically of drugs that need to come down. So it's work that has large global impact where we're able to get more medications out through these technologies, safer, more effective, and quicker, as well as more affordable to the American people and people all across the world.
Well, Rahul, this is fascinating, and it sounds really promising to have potential impacts, like you said, that could be global scale, which I think is absolutely remarkable. And we talked throughout our conversation about some of the people that you work with around the globe in your efforts to improve health and safety. So can you maybe share some details about these collaborations, whether they're in the field of anti-doping or others?
I think when we talk about working across the globe, it becomes important to find partners that are also sharing your work, but also advancing the cause. In the era of drug discovery, We've had sort of the classic pharmaceutical companies, which have, as I described, the issue of developing drugs over a long, long time, and often using as a base the funds of taxpayer funds of NIH to do that. That's all changing. I mean, one of the things we're going to see in the future is the tech industry work with what we call tech bio, like GATC Health, as well as the biotech industry, which is actually working on compounds development for rare and ultra rare diseases, and then work with pharmaceutical industry. So all of this will take partners across the globe to come together. There's a lot of work that is happening across this globe now in a way that it's really creating that partnership and collaboration. It was never there before. There's a number of countries that want to see our anti-doping efforts in partnership exceed the expectations of athletes and really create environments in which when they're competing, they don't have to worry about, is this going to be a fair game or not? They should be focused on how they do and how their training has been. And that mental focus is so important when you're at highest levels of competition. We have coming on the U.S. soil in the next decade. I mean, I call it the golden decade in sports because we're going to have FIFA World Cup. We're going to have the 2028 Olympics in LA, for which qualifiers will begin to happen very quickly soon. And then we have the 2034 Salt Lake City Games as well. We're going to have so many competition on the U.S. soil that it is going to be important to collaborate with both international partners as well as international agencies that work on ensuring that at the end of the day, it's about the trust of the athletes in sports and trust the American people and people all over the globe that when they watch their favorite athlete compete, that athlete will get a fair shake in the competition. That's what this is bottom line about.
Absolutely. I think you brought up some great points there. And I think you're absolutely right that this is a really exciting time coming up for U.S. sports. And in general, just these partnerships are critical for advancing the clean sport movement. And of course, partnership is in the PCC's name. And you were the keynote speaker at the recent PCC 2025 conference. Rahul, can you share how you first heard about the Partnership for Clean Competition and what was your experience like attending the meeting earlier this year and sharing some of the work that you've done?
Well, thank you, Marie. The Partnership for Clean Competition is so important across this country because what I see is the partnership engaging so many various and diverse, really, stakeholders, everyone from United States Anti-Doping Agency to Song for Charlie, a group that's focused on after loss to ensure that we focus on prevention and treatment and access, to so many other partners. And I was fortunate to be keynote speaker. You look at professional sports and the commitment that they have through Partnership for Clean Competition. And I've shared some of this conversation that we have today, but also the challenges that clean sport will be facing moving forward is also important. And it's so good to know that PCC is at the forefront. Not only that, but they're actually engaging in the most important partnerships, both within the professional sport, but outside of professional sport, to tell those stories, because it's not just our athletes, but it's also their families. It's their community and network that often gets impacted. We hear about so many stories about our athletes. They shared how they were struggling with one of their family members at the same time, suffering from addiction or was incarcerated or other aspects were happening in general life. We know that has an impact on the field. So this is so important for PCC to lead with that voice, to be able to support the athletes, but also their families and the communities that they are in through the mission, through the standards that have been created. And it was important for me to be a part of it and speak about the value that PCC is providing to sports community as such and beyond because of the work that they do and the partnerships that they have.
And Rahul, I really love that you highlighted the diverse audience that attended this conference. All of these different organizations and individuals came together, whether it was scientists, national anti-doping organizations, athletes, sport leagues and sport organizations, and just people from all over the world who are invested and involved in the anti-doping movement. And I think it's so critical to build these bridges and have these conversations that traverse some of these normal boundaries, whether it's the type of organization or the geographical boundaries or even just the different fields and backgrounds that people are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely, Marie. I think whether it's the amazing work that gets done at the United States Anti-Doping Agency or the Olympics and Paralympics Committee of the United States working in close partnership with the International Olympics Committee or professional sports. I mean, I was at the Major League Baseball headquarters there speaking, and just amazing to see the wonderful teamwork really in action that works to support PCC. So all of this is important work. It impacts so many of us. And the leadership that's been exhibiting there is so important because we can't do it alone. None of us can.
Certainly. Well, Rahul, we appreciate you joining us for the conference and serving as the keynote speaker and sharing part of your story. And as you highlighted, there are still many challenges that the anti-doping community faces. But if we gave you all of the resources you could possibly dream up, what is the one problem that you would want to solve first?
I think when it comes to the anti-doping communities and the work, the larger issue would be to make sure that we have the full trust of athletes everywhere into the anti-doping programs, whether they're within your sport, within the large national context, or the global context. So what I found through my work, that it is easy to break trust. It's very difficult to build that trust. And it's important work. Whether we are working at global levels, at world stage, or at national and subnational levels, it's really important to continue to work to build that trust with athletes and with larger communities. Because at the end of the day, sports is about trusting in a system and then competing within that system. And to me, the one, I wouldn't even call it a problem. I would say one element we must keep at the front and center is to make sure that when athletes compete, we have done everything in the background possible, that they have no doubts that they're working and competing at a level playing field, and they feel good about that. And whether they win or they do not, they go home thinking that they did the best, they performed the best they could, and they'll come back next time.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important message. Building that trust, forging those connections with the people, the communities that you serve is absolutely critical. And we appreciate you sharing so many of your insights and stories with all of us today, Rahul. But if our listeners want to learn even more, what is the best way they can do so?
The first, I think, if you want to learn more about the anti-doping aspect, I think there's just a couple of resources you can go to. You can go to USADA.org, USADA.org. That's the United States Anti-Doping Agency. You can also go to the White House website for ONDCP for anti-doping and a variety of other aspects of our drug control policies. The website is whitehouse.gov/ONDCP. That's whitehouse.gov/ONDCP. You can, of course, go if you want to learn about the most cutting edge drug discovery and predictive analytics, precision medicine work happening, to GATC's website, which I get very excited about always. Mm-hmm. That is GATChealth.com. And then finally, you can always check me out on my LinkedIn page. That one should be very easy. You can find me at Rahul Gupta, president of GATC Health in Irvine, California.
Excellent. Well, Rahul, thank you so much for sharing these resources. Listeners, definitely take some time to check out these websites. Get connected with Rahul on LinkedIn. And Rahul, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was such a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Marie, and I really appreciate your work and glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, we appreciate everything that you've been doing over the years. And listeners, we appreciate you joining us as well. If you haven't already, it would be wonderful if you could take a moment to subscribe to our podcast. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.